So welcome. My name is Catherine Tercer with Common Cause Ohio. Folks have been slowly coming in. I'm going to encourage you all to put your name and where you're from into the chat. If you have questions, please put it into the Q&A box. And I really just want to welcome you. Now, today's conversation will, of course, focus on rule of law. We're going to focus on democracy. We'll also be talking about things like, well, what is the role of the courts? What about recent attacks on the courts? And then we're going to talk about ways to take action. And Mia, if you're willing to go to the next slide. I did want to highlight, when we started this conversation, I was hoping, that we could have in-depth conversation with two really accomplished people. But I also thought, we need a moment to really just sit for a moment and think about, for the folks who are not attorneys, I'm somebody who is not an attorney. And so I just wanted to say, let's take a moment to think about, due process. And this is probably not something that we spent a lot of time thinking about last year. Now, the photo that is here is from the No Kings protest. And I was really struck, there were lots of No Kings signs. And there was this young woman with the due process is a right, not a privilege. And it is a fundamental principle of law designed to protect our individual rights. And it is so important if we think about all the different ways that government and government power could be abused, that we have due process in this country. And with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce our two conversationalists. We have Subodh Chandra. Now, he is an attorney that many of you are going to be familiar with. He was a former federal prosecutor. He was a law director for the city of Cleveland. He also received this award, a fellowship from the John Gardner Foundation. And the thing that I love about this is, of course, John Gardner was the founder of Common Cause, and this fellowship, the John Gardner Fellowship that Subodh received, was to serve as a fellow in Dick Select's office. And so many of us will think back to that Dick Select's office and his tenure. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight, that Subodh is also here to tell you about some recent things that have happened for him while he is in court. He recently had a preliminary injunction related to Doge. So put your questions in the Q&A. Please feel free to chat amongst yourself as we're having as they're having their conversations. And then I'm going to introduce you to Omar. And Mia, I'm going to ask you to pull up Spotlight Omar and Subodh while we do this. So for Omar, the thing that struck me first was, yes, these folks are incredibly accomplished. And that Omar received an award in 2021 from the American Bar Association, called On the Rise, Top 40 Lawyers Under 40. Now, he served as a presidential appointee in the Biden administration in the U.S. Justice Department Civil Rights Division. He also is somebody who works at Common Cause Ohio. He is our senior VP for policy and litigation. And with that, I'm going to ask each of the gentlemen, Omar and Subodh, to actually share a little bit about yourself. Oh, and Mia's absolutely right. I said Common Cause Ohio because I say it all day, every day. But Omar is with Common Cause. And with that, I'm handing it over to you, Omar, to get the conversation flowing.
Sure. I'm not muted, right? Sure. Thank you, Catherine. I'm really excited to be here today and to be in conversation with Subodh and to talk about some really timely topics that I know many of you are thinking about. And so I thought we'd, kick this off with the where Catherine left off on due process, and what does due process mean in people's everyday lives? Why should we care about it? Oftentimes, it's used in court filings and it's used in the media, and I think it can be a little bit of abstract. And so, but I was hoping that you could talk to us about what is due process, why is it so important, and who does it cover in the United States? Does it cover only citizens? Does it cover everybody? What does due process look like in our everyday lives?
Well, I'll start with the last part, Omar, and thank you, Common Cause and Fair Courts, for organizing this, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Due process applies to all of us. Due process applies to immigrants as well. Now, there may be different levels of due process depending on the government action at issue, but we are all entitled to due process. What does it fundamentally mean? It just means fairness. It just means notice about what you're being accused of or what the issue is, and an opportunity to respond, a fair opportunity to respond. That's all it means. And we use these fancy lawyer words, due process, but it really just comes down to things that all of us as human beings would expect if we're being accused of some sort of legal violation, criminal, civil, administrative. And so, using the example of immigrants, it simply comes down to if the government or government agents believe that you are here illegally and need to be deported or detained for whatever reason, they're supposed to give you notice and a fair opportunity to respond. It could be that they're mistaken. We've seen numerous instances in the last few weeks of US citizens who are being detained, suspected of being here illegally. Based on what? Based on the color of their skin, typically. And so that's all it means. Due process means notice as an opportunity to respond, and that's something we all expect in the way that we're treated by our fellow human beings. It's certainly something we're entitled to in how we're treated by our government.
Yeah, and I think some other aspects, like examples that folks may not think about is like you get a speeding ticket, right? You have the opportunity to contest the ticket. That's due process. When there are rules in place and you don't know about those rules and you say like, hey, that's not fair. I didn't know that this rule was in place. Like that's part of due process. Your ability to create an argument about why you think either the rule is unfair or the procedure by which, the mechanism by which you're contesting it is unfair, all of that is due process. And so if you could talk to us a little bit about, the recent Supreme Court orders about you mentioned the deportation and in some cases, detention of folks who have documents and are considered, lawful immigrants. If you could talk to us a little bit about what the Supreme Court has been doing and what courts have been doing regarding due process and the immigration crackdown that the Trump administration is trying to employ across the country.
Well, let's start with the trial courts, Omar. What has been unsurprising to me is how trial courts who really understand due process in their bones, because every day in and day out, they're giving people due process, they have almost uniformly said, no, if you're going to detain people, and certainly if you're going to deport people to foreign lands or foreign prisons, you must afford people due process. We're not just going to take the government's word for it that you've done your job properly. The government does make mistakes. I'm a former federal prosecutor. I made mistakes. My office made mistakes. And the purpose of due process is to verify and to correct those things. So the trial courts have been pretty good on these issues. The Supreme Court, shockingly enough, has not. Its most recent decision last week was quite a shock to me, where it effectively said, "Go ahead, and while the case is pending, you can go ahead and just keep deporting people off to foreign lands and foreign prisons." It is astonishing. What they did was they lifted a stay of the order. They essentially just said, you can go ahead while the case is pending. We're not going to stop you for now. It's really a shocking turn of events to have the Supreme Court of the United States turn its back on due process, turn its back on fundamental liberties, and essentially say, hey, we all just have to trust the government, that the government's doing everything right. That's where we are, unfortunately, with increasing confidence on my part in the lower federal courts, across party lines of the appointees of the judges appointed, by the way, and diminishing confidence in the integrity and commitment of the U.S. Supreme Court when it comes to handling our basic constitutional rights.
And something I think about like the importance of due process and, as you very eloquently put it, fairness in our system is that when there isn't fairness and something bad happens, oftentimes the remedy, as we talk about as lawyers, but like, how do you fix the bad thing that happened? Like, the bad thing has already happened. And, sure, we can say there may be in some instances money damages or damages, money in response. It could be to try and reverse something that's happened. But if you could talk a little bit about the case when uh, someone would be deported
Right.
and the court's saying, and the Supreme Court saying, like, well, the administration doesn't have to bring someone back. They need to use, to help facilitate that language around whether or not they're like instructed. Do the courts mandate that a certain remedy or a certain kind of fix to something that happened has to happen versus what the courts are saying the administration does when they do make mistakes?
Well, it's an incredibly important distinction. What the remedy is going to be is an incredibly important distinction because what, unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court did was give the administration the excuse to basically just mess around and dissemble and give half answers and non-answers, not just in court, but in congressional testimony. And what you had was an instance in which it became pretty clear that the administration was defying certainly the lower court order, which was intended at bringing Kilmar Abrego Garcia back. Now, they eventually came up with their own sort of clever way of quote unquote complying with the order, which is filing what just so nakedly appear to be trumped up criminal charges that, no pun intended, that what you have is a situation where it's sort of a wink and a nod to the compliance. I think at the end of the day, we're really reaching a point in this country where I think as lawyers we often think about it. If where there are rights but no remedies, the rights are illusory. There's just no right at all. And so if the court is not allowed to say, no, you need to bring him back. You sent him there. You clearly have an arrangement with this foreign despot. You need to bring him back and you need to take all steps necessary to bring him back. There's a big difference between that and doing what the Supreme Court said, which was, well, just facilitate it. Okay, then now that's subject to interpretation. And we're seeing that kind of cuteness in how the law is being applied and enforced. And I think that we really are in a constitutional crisis right now. Everybody who says, are we in a constitutional crisis? And I've heard commentators dissemble and say, well, we're not quite there yet. No, I think we're there right now. When rights have no remedies, when the law is meaningless, when you can essentially grab a whole bunch of people off the street and ship them off to a foreign land, it could happen to you, it could happen to me, it could happen to anybody on this call. And when the Supreme Court has said, fine, just go ahead and figure it out later without affording due process, we're in a constitutional crisis.
I think I really like the when rights have no remedies line. I think that's one folks hopefully will remember and why we're paying so much attention in the legal community. And we'll get to some of these later, like who is actually paying attention and who isn't. But at least the folks that are assembled here today are paying so much attention to this front end fairness because when the bad thing happens, if there's no remedy, if there's no way to fix it, then what was the point of the right to begin with? So you've touched a little bit on this already, Subodh, about some of the other threats we're facing. You mentioned constitutional crisis. I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit of like a landscape analysis from your assessment. What are some of the other threats that folks should kind of have top of mind at this point?
So look, I could literally go on in answer to this question for a good 6 hours in a Fidel Castro like speech that just goes on and on. I'm going to hit some of the highlights, but it's important that people pay attention to everything that's going on. Let me just start off with perhaps one of the most shocking things that I've seen happen, which is the attack of the administration on law firms. I mean, going after law firms and making demands on law firms essentially because they're exercising their First Amendment rights of speech and First Amendment rights of association, including the kinds of clients that they take on. And now, this isn't, by the way, a matter open to debate. That's literally what the president's executive orders said. They didn't say I'm violating your First Amendment rights, but they were triggering all of those concerns because of who your clients are, because of what you've done, because of what you've said, because you support DEI. And so in those instances, when you see it's bad enough that we had this unprecedented assault on lawyers and the rule of law. It's that some of the biggest, baddest law firms in the country, or at least who held themselves out that way, suddenly bent the knee and capitulated. And bent the knee is not my phrase, and it's not just a Game of Thrones phrase. It is literally the phrase of the White House spokesperson characterizing the behavior of the law firms that then capitulated to the administration. That is should be cause for great alarm by all of us, because if lawyers are too afraid to fight, even for themselves, then who else is going to fight for the rest of us? So it was incredibly disheartening not only to see the attack, but to see the capitulation. But it should give everyone on this call a surge of pride and confidence that there were law firms that stood up. Perkins Coie, to start with, Wilmer Hale, there's several others. But what they've done is they've stood up, and alongside them, are firms like ours. Hundreds of firms filed amici briefs supporting that. And look, the firms that fought have been winning. They've been winning. It's a no-brainer from a constitutional standpoint, the number of constitutional rights that were being violated. So that's one example. We've seen, obviously, we've already talked a little bit about the corruption of the immigration system and what's been happening there. The Department of Justice, I commend to everybody, I'm going to copy and paste into the chat right now. Slate did a piece on what's happened to the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, what their responsibilities are, and how they've essentially collapsed in those responsibilities. U.S. Department of Education, Office for Civil Rights, that enforce civil rights in K through higher education, destroyed. My wife worked there. She was in charge of the entire Midwest. Of the 150 people who reported to her, 120 of them lost their jobs. These were distinguished public servants who did things like the Larry Nassar case, the doctor at Michigan State. So we are losing these services, the attacks on the Social Security Administration, the ripping off of personally identifiable information from federal employees, which my firm, along with several other co-counsel, have obtained a preliminary injunction against DOJ and OPM over that. So across the board, we're seeing attacks on the rule of law, and we can talk about some of the more specifics later and maybe in Q&A. But this is truly a crisis. What is giving me hope, and what I want everybody to hang on to hope for here, is that the forces of resistance and the forces of rebellion on these attacks are coalescing, are working together, are forming coalitions, and are filled with resolve to fight to preserve our democracy and the rule of law.
You brought up the law firms. I will say that I think one of the things we're seeing is a collective action problem within various industries. And one of the tactics has been to try and like pick off leaders within industries one by one. So we saw that with the higher education by going after Columbia and Harvard, with the law firms going after some of the biggest law firms in the country. And initially, it seemed like that was a winning strategy for the administration, that these firms were capitulating and were, bending the knee. But I think now, as Subodh mentioned, in terms of like some hope, is that there is a recognition of like, oh, if we're going to be in this thinking just of our individual self-interest rather than our collective self-interest, our common cause, if I may, then
You may.
then we're in a lot more trouble when we don't think in that collective. And so, tell me about some of those who are fighting. Who else, lawyers play a big role in this. Obviously, we've talked about that. But who else is fighting? Who else within, the legal community and beyond? And what do they need?
So I'm going to start off with a lot of the legal actors and players, and then I'm going to move to some of the non-legal folks. But I'm going to be talking fast because I want to get a lot of information out. And if some of the moderators could start putting links for these organizations into the chat, I'd appreciate it as I go so that I don't slow down. Okay, I'm going to start off with the ACLU, which, to its credit, within 100 days of the start of the administration, had filed 53 major lawsuits against the Trump administration. 53. That was just 100 days in. I talked to them maybe just a week before that, and it was 51, right? Like they are moving, and every opportunity they are seeing to try to uh, correct the universe, they are taking. I commend them for it. They need help. They need to ramp up their capacity. They have hundreds of lawyers in the DC office and they have lawyers in their affiliates around the country. But they essentially, from talking to their national legal director, she has told me they essentially need to double their capacity. They're a huge law firm, but they're not big enough to deal with all of the challenges. So, first and foremost, ACLU. Democracy Defenders. It's a very important organization headed up by Norm Eisen, a former federal ethics official. They are doing a great job with a lot of these attacks. Democracy Forward is another one that I would urge people to look at. There is an immigration group. I'm going to find the name in a little bit here. I got it in my notes, but there is an immigration. I'll find the name and put it in there. But there are several immigration organizations that are doing great work. You also have, let's turn to some of the I want to mention one other group that I think has become very important, the Rule of Law Clinic. It's the Peter Gruber, Gruber, Rule of Law Clinic at the Yale Law School, is headed up by former Yale Law School dean, former State Department legal advisor, former Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, Secretary of State for Human Rights, Harold H. Koh, Koh. That clinic has already played a pivotal role in developing amicus briefs in key cases, friend of the court briefs saying, representing lots and lots of bipartisan national security officials on the issues of the day. They've been highlighting the importance of Harvard University and other universities to producing great world leaders. They've been doing commendable work on a shoestring budget. They've just gotten started up and ramped up. They can use help right now. They can use financial resources. So these are some of the examples of the legal groups. I want to turn very quickly before we move on to the next question to some of the groups that do legal work, but also are in the kind of civic education and rallying space. Common Cause, first and foremost, Common Cause. If you look at Common Cause's website, you will find action item lists that they're offering you of things that you can do. Every single person, lawyer or non-lawyer, can do every single day to try to fight for the rule of law. Indivisible nationally, another major group. Protect Democracy, fantastic organization that has great resources on how to identify fascism, how to fight fascism. So those are some examples. But these organizations need financial help right now, and anything you can do to help boost their ability and resources is going to make a big, big difference. Pick
And if
one,
I
pick one or two, adopt them, and start raising money from your friends for them.
and if I can take a point of personal privilege about Common Cause,
Please.
is that we are also, and this and many of the groups that Subodh mentioned do this as well, but we are really focusing both on our organizing capacity. And so we need, yes, money. All these organizations can use financial resources. If you think about what Elon Musk pumped into the last general election, and then in the Wisconsin's, Supreme Court election, like these are like close to $500 million. That was spent, by one person. And so we can get into dark money and politics and all that sort of thing as well. But so yes, financial resources, but also your time. Common Cause, has a great program for being able to mobilize volunteers, whether that's phone banking, whether that's our election protection program. And we recently hired in our DC national office my counterpart and colleague who's going to lead up our campaigns and organizing. And we're really focusing on building out that people power on the ground. So more to come from us. And please check out all the other organizations that Subodh mentioned and that folks have been placing in the chat. So, we talked about these great organizations and the great work that's being done in the civic space and the legal space. And I don't want to bring us down quite yet. But, what are some of the limitations we're facing in our ability to push back against some of the threats that you've talked about, whether that's due process violation, threats to rule of law? I want to make sure folks have like level setting in terms of expectations. And as we, continue through, we'll, be able to talk about what these limitations mean in practice and how we can get around them. But I think it's important to talk about what some of the limitations are.
Well, look, the first and foremost cap on the limitation on some of the legal fights is the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, the cases that go to the U.S. Supreme Court, they're strictly discretionary, right? So the U.S. Supreme Court doesn't take on every single case, and there have been a couple of cases where they've said no to the administration's efforts to try to appeal something. So I think that is a constraint. Give me a sense of, Omar, of what you're alluding at here. I mean, tell me what you have in mind.
Well, I'm thinking, we are doing all these different things to push back, but it's important to recognize like what are some of the roadblocks because that can inform our strategy of how to break through those roadblocks. So at Common Cause, we're thinking about like what are the roadblocks to people-powered democracy. So one of the things, we work on is gerrymandered maps and
Yeah.
gerrymandering that don't give folks, an equal voice in our democracy.
And that's a significant factor. So, for example, one of the pieces of advice I give people right now when they're looking for what can I do, is look, adopt a swing district and organize, adopt, a state that you think you could make a difference with organizing capacity there and help local people on the ground organize and educate people. But extreme gerrymandering, like what we have in Ohio, has really essentially killed off democracy. I mean, we have a state where the biggest number of voters are independents, and there are pluralities of Republicans and Democrats, but we have total Republican dominance of the state house and of the congressional seats through extreme gerrymandering that is so absurd. I don't know if somebody wants to put a copy of one of these districts here, but we have districts that are just absurd looking. And so as a result, it's very difficult to get your government to be responsive to anything, including majority will. So that's a significant roadblock. I don't think it's going to be entirely insurmountable forever, but certainly for some period of time, it's a significant period of time, it's going to be a significant roadblock. That's one example. I would say, the financial resource constraints, people resource constraints, everybody's running around in some ways, unfocused. And that's why I would urge everybody listening in on the call, look, go a little easy on yourself. You can't do everything. I know we're all doom scrolling, we're all hyperventilating. You got to take a deep breath every day and say to yourself, what are the one or two things I can do today to put that little ripple into the pool of the universe, right? And make a few waves. And one of the things I'm going to keep repeating throughout this call is just download the Five Calls app. The Five Calls app. Get that app. You can download it on your phone during this call. It makes calling your members of Congress and your senators really easy. Now, that may feel like a fool's errand when you live in a place like Ohio, that has people that are aligned with the administration and its actions, but I don't think it is. I think they need to hear from us every single day on a different issue about what your concerns are. It's so easy to use. It's fun to use. You can tell your friends about it. But that's an example of a tool where you can help build capacity just from the comfort of your own home and make sure that your voice is being heard all of the time.
That's a great suggestion. What I used to do is I actually put in my phone, like in my contacts, like my US Senator from California, Alex Padilla, Adam Schiff, and I put their DC office number in my phone as a contact so that it just reduced that friction and that barrier to entry to be able to call them. And I did the same with my state assembly members, my state senators, my city council member. And I'm telling you from working here in DC, folks, like they do pay attention to the
They
calls.
do.
Now, not on every issue, may not move the needle, but when they start to remember that they have constituents who are paying attention to what they are doing, that the media cycle, is not moving fast enough where people aren't understanding what the stakes are and that they care about them, that gives pause. And on some issues, it may not and ultimately get the result you want. But on a lot of issues where there is friction between, our congressional leaders and your state house leaders and the executive, like it can make a difference. I saw you wanted to jump in there, Subodh.
Well, all I was going to say is that so that that five calls app, as somebody pointed out in the chat, it pre-programs all of that for you. So you put in your address and then boom, it pre-populates. You want to call Senator Husted, dial this. You want to call Senator Marino, just click on a button and it calls right through to their office and you're going to get the voicemail. And here's the beauty of this, folks. If you're an insomniac like me, worried about democracy and the rule of law, you wake up in the middle of the night, do it then. Nobody's going to answer, but you're going to leave a voicemail, right? And so they need to hear from us. They need to hear that we care because what is happening right now and what one of the hallmarks of fascism is they're trying to wear you out. They're trying to make it so you give up. They're trying to make you not care anymore. They're trying to make it so you don't communicate anymore. So what you really need to do is say to yourself, that's not going to be me. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some little action. So even if it's the middle of the night, even if it's just you're in transit, you're taking a walk, say what you need to say through that thing. Keep expressing yourself. They need to hear from you every day. Think about it. If everybody on this call did that right after this call, every single person on this, we got a couple hundred people on this call. If every single one of these people were calling their senators and their members of Congress and expressing themselves on some issue, that starts to have an impact. They start to realize that we're watching.
And I'll give a really concrete example, something that's happening right now. So some of you may be following the budget process that's playing out in DC, where they're trying to put together a reconciliation package, which just basically means they're trying to put together the budget for the federal government.
The big
And
ugly bill, the big ugly bill.
the ugliest bill. The they slipped in there initially a provision that would ban states and local municipalities from passing any laws to regulate AI, artificial intelligence, for 10 years. That ultimately changed a bit from a really drastic measure because there was some opposition there was opposition from Democrats, but also a lot of opposition from Republicans. So then it changed to a funding issue so that if you want certain funds, you have to not pass any laws related to AI regulation for 10 years. But there are still several Republicans in the Senate who are uncomfortable with that, and calling those offices, right, makes a difference to know that, like, oh, my constituents actually care about this. And that would have huge implications for our democracy and the ability for states and local jurisdictions to be able to regulate something that's an emergent technology. So sometimes it's really big, high level things, but other times it could be smaller things. And when you call, it doesn't have to be anything profound. You don't need to, have a Shakespearean monologue prepared. It's just like, hey, this thing that I heard, in the news that's going on, I'm against it. And I don't want you
That's
to
it.
either, oh no, that's it. That's all you need to
That's it.
do.
It's two sentences on what the issue is and what your position is and what you're urging them to do. That's it.
So, we talked about some of the things. I just want to give an opportunity. Are there other things you think that, us in our everyday lives can or should be doing in this moment?
I do, and I'm gonna bullet point them really fast, but then I want to elaborate on some of them. Okay, so let's talk about first of all your economic power. Okay. You have a lot of economic power individually and collectively. And there are people paying very close attention to what certain companies are doing, and rightly so, like Tesla, SpaceX. Now, we're not going to be able to influence SpaceX, but certainly Elon Musk's conduct in government has brought a lot of negative attention to Tesla. So what I would say is use your economic power in terms of where you choose to spend your money, where you choose not to spend your money, and organize others accordingly. That is First Amendment protected activity. Economic boycotts are First Amendment protected activity, and you should exercise those First Amendment rights. Um, you can also look at the issue of we talked about the financial donations to organizations, keep those going, but there are other tasks, large and small, that you can do besides using the Five Calls app, right? I what I think we need to do is we need to continue to start to have conversations with people who might be on the fence about what happened. There's a phenomenon occurring right now, if you pay attention, social media, where people who voted for this administration are having regrets. And while it's tempting when people are having regrets because something extreme is happening to them to have Schadenfreude, and I will confess to some Schadenfreude in these instances, um, it's important to engage those folks and talk to them and enlist them and have them be a part of this movement of people. Talk to them about the Five Calls app. Tell them that they need to start, getting active. They need to get involved in local community organizations. They need to engage with national organizations. I think reaching out outside of our bubbles and silos is incredibly important. Finally, I know this is going to sound crazy, but letters to traditional media. Traditional media are still out there. Letters to the editor, petitions, emails, letters, calls to traditional media. When traditional media are hearing from you that you really care and are passionate about something, they tend to respond. They might print your letters. Okay. So those are just a few of the things. I talked about adopting swing districts. I talked about, paying attention to what's going on outside of your area. If it seems hopeless, then fine. Pick a place that you're going to care about. And I do want to mention, I know I said finally, but there's one last thing I want to say, and that is there is a great deal of racism coursing through the veins of America being pumped out of the White House right now. Not just racism, but other forms of bigotry, anti-LGBTQ sentiment, and other things. I think it's very important that you speak up and you speak out about those things. We become numb to it. We hate it. We can't stand it. We can't believe it. And I know that there's a debate that goes on where people say, well, I don't want to amplify that voice by repeating it. I don't want to react to it. But you have to understand that when you speak up and speak out about that kind of bigotry, there might be somebody who's watching, who's been silent, who's been affected by it, that it gives comfort to. Your actions and your speaking out can have a real impact on that vulnerable person who is even thinking about suicide. And we've seen this administration attack, LGBTQ folks having a special spot in the National Suicide Hotline, right? I mean, that's so just think about that. Think about your own actions and your own speech in a way and counteracting the hateful speech that is out there right now.
Really well said. And I think, one thing I think about the speaking out is oftentimes silence can be interpreted as
Yes.
complicity. And so even just taking a stand saying, I do not agree, um, can be really powerful.
Yeah,
And so
people can feel real comfort in seeing you speak up, and you may never hear from them, but you speaking up will make a difference.
I want to end on these sets of questions before we turn to some of the ones that have come through in the chat. Is there hope? Do you have reason, given some of the stuff we've talked about, to have hope in this moment?
I think so. I think that there's actually a great deal of reason to be hopeful, and which just sounds crazy coming out of my mouth, given the losing battles I feel like I'm fighting. But I will tell you why. I feel like something has changed. Something is turning in America right now. Just a couple weeks ago, at the No Kings protests around the country, there are an estimated 3 million people who participated in those protests. And there's been some commentary that those may be the largest protests that have ever taken place in American history. When you think about America's history and you think about civil rights and the Vietnam War, I mean, that's a phenomenal achievement. I sense the tide turning. I sense people who don't pay attention to politics, waking up and paying attention to politics. And while everything that's been going on is incredibly divisive and polarizing, and our social media are segmented, and even the media we consume are segmented, think MSNBC versus Fox. I'm sensing that there's a broadening consensus among a silent majority that what's happening is unacceptable. What's happening is something that they want to see end and that they want to see stop. And so I think the work that everybody here does day in and day out in communicating to people and engaging with people and engaging with organizations and to being boots on the ground in this fight against fascism, I think it will collectively make a difference eventually. There's one thing I left out of the things that people can do that ties in with this, and that is amplifying the arts. I hope somebody will put the Instagram page and the YouTube pages of Billy Simons Jr. Billy Simons Jr., Simons Jr. He's a modern day folk singer who is putting out some amazingly eloquent songs. He's got a Spotify channel as well. Um, just beautiful songs about this moment and what's happening. And it's a tinge of sarcasm and it's a tinge of uplift and it's a tinge of humor. And I really believe that if we could get everybody to listen to Billy Simons Jr.'s, music, we would change the world. I mean, it's like a modern day Pete Seeger. And so that's just one example. But amplify the arts because there may be hearts and minds that you're able to reach by sharing artwork that just by normal political dialogue we're not able to achieve.
Thank you for that uplifting conclusion to this part of our conversation. So now I want to move to some of the questions that have come through in the chat, and one of them relates to Trump sending in troops on U.S. soil to Los Angeles several weeks ago. There's a law called the Posse Comitatus Act, which talks about prohibiting, the president and the military from using the military for law enforcement purposes. And it's related to another question that we also got about a growing concern that Trump will declare martial law in an effort to delay or cancel the midterm elections. And so this question is both like what may be going on here, but also like what can we do now to prevent against that kind of potential eventuality?
Which of those eventualities were you referring to? The
The declaring of martial law and the use of the military for law enforcement purposes.
I think ultimately there's going to be a combination of two things that prevents that. Court action, if courts stand up and say, no, that's just unacceptable. And the administration has to be willing to comply, which so far they've been hedging on. Like Secretary Hegseth, for example, would not answer the question about whether he would comply with court orders, just wouldn't answer it. But I think it's going to be a combination of the courts, and it's going to be a combination of that and mass action. And I think if that eventuality occurs, I think the level of protest and the level of resistance that we see happen in this country will be, history making. Because I just think it is so antithetical to what it means to be an American, to think about, being some kind of a country where you can have martial law declared. And it's just so unacceptable to who we are that I think it will galvanize the public in a way, and it would be a moment in which the administration is overstepped. That doesn't mean it won't be incredibly dangerous. That doesn't mean that American troops won't be used against Americans. It doesn't mean those things. I'm not being Pollyannish about this, but I certainly know that if that happens, all bets are off and I'm out on the streets and I'd be willing to risk my law license over that because it would be such a fundamentally lawless act for the administration to engage in. And one would hope that even this US Supreme Court would do the right thing and pull back from the brink. But they do seem to be of a mind, the majority on that court, in which, hey, if Trump does it, it's fine. If a Democratic administration does it, it's somehow executive overreach. That does seem to be the common thread of unprincipled principle that seems to glue that majority together. So we will have to see. I really hope it doesn't come to that. But we've seen a level of pretext. I mean, this is not a joke, right? General Mattis said, I mean, he wrote in his book, he said that Trump asked about shooting protesters in the leg. I mean, so we know that the president has that level of derangement and lawlessness. The real question is whether there will be any adults in the room to stop him. And that leadership composition seems to have changed from the first administration to this administration. So we will have to see.
I really appreciate you talking about the potential danger that is out there. And I think, we saw, thankfully, other than a few instances, even though they were tragic in Utah and of course in Minnesota before the No Kings actual rally started, that largely peaceful, largely, a lot of joy there. Folks in the chat have been talking about the wonderful signs people had out on that day. And so, I suspect that there'll be more opportunities for that type of protest. But if we're talking about, an eventuality where martial law may be used to delay an election and the Supreme Court punts or doesn't get involved or does, and the administration openly flouts that, I think we are in a dangerous time, and showing up with yourself in the streets and mass protest is not going to be a risk-free endeavor.
Right.
And so I want to, level set with everyone about that. But I also want to say we've seen from a global context, and I think on one of the slides that had my undergraduate studies was in international affairs. And when you look at other countries that have had democratic backsliding and rising authoritarianism, the US no longer can, so sometimes we like to think of ourselves as being unique, and there's like a uniqueness about American democracy. And I think the last several years and this year, these first 100 or so days have shown we're not so unique. But the tide turns when there is mass protest. There is some a study by some social science researchers that talks about, I think, is it 3% or 3.5%, when 3.5% of the population are engaged in active protest against authoritarianism across the board over, modern global history, that those authoritarian regimes fall. And so I hope we don't get to a place where folks have to put their bodies, themselves, in harm's way. Uh, but that it is something we should be talking about. So thank you for that question, and thank you, Spode, for your answer there. Um, I'm gonna group, and this may be the final question, just given the time. I'm gonna group like several questions together here, and these have to do more with access to justice, Subodh. So like, for folks who are fearing that they could be picked up, or in the words of someone here, nabbed off the street, like what recourse do folks have in terms of getting legal representation when they may not have the finances to do that, or they may be in the wrong place at the wrong time at a protest and get arrested? Like, what resources are there for folks to get legal representation with limited financial resources?
Yeah, so you can only imagine that the capacity of so many of the organizations and law firms that do this work, and even the for-profit law firms that do this work, are getting stretched to the breaking point right now. But there is an Immigration Legal Resource Center, which I mentioned in the chat. Immigration Legal Resource Center, that's a decent place to start. Again, everybody's getting overwhelmed with capacity right now. If you are undocumented and in that situation, you need to try to reach out to one of those organizations, or have a family member reach out to one of those organizations to see if they can find a lawyer. There are lawyers that are increasingly volunteering for this work. What's interesting is it used to be that some of the largest law firms used to offer pro bono help for these types of projects because it was a good training opportunity, and also feel good exercise for their junior associates to keep those people interested and engaged in the otherwise incredibly boring work. But there's less and less of that happening now as the biggest law firms are shrinking in fear from the administration. Again, there are exceptions like Perkins Coie and Jenner and Block and some of the other firms that have fought, but they too are being stretched to capacity. So, I mean, people are going to have to, you can reach out if you live in, you could reach out to the Ohio State Bar Association to get a referral to an immigration lawyer. There's an American Immigration Lawyers Association that has a large membership. But you may need to have the financial resources. You may not be able to get free assistance. You may need to have the financial resources or have people on the outside who are able to assemble the financial resources to get you legal assistance. And if there's anybody on the call, I don't know if there's anybody on the call from any of the legal aid societies. I'm uncertain about whether they are able to represent people in this situation. I think the answer is no. There is a group in Columbus, Ohio, that's in Columbus and other parts of Southern Ohio called ABLE. And I know ABLE is able to provide immigration-related services, but organizations that are funded, it's possible that organizations that are funded by the National Legal Services Corporation are not able to provide this service. So if somebody knows the answer to that, please put it into the chat.
And I'll say, in addition to like the state bar association, local bar associations also have like pro bono clinics and other types of pro bono networks. And
Yeah.
so depending on where you are in the state, kind of taking a look at the local state bar association and what kind of resources that they have compiled.
And there
And
are
what
legal clinics at law schools, Omar. So, for example, my alma mater, the Yale Law School, does have an immigration law clinic that provides services. I think they're mostly doing that for people in Connecticut and possibly New York, but a number of the law schools do have immigration law clinics where students get the opportunity to help.
Well, it's been wonderful to be in conversation with you, Subodh. And so, given the time we're at, I'm going to hand it back over to Catherine to close us out.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you so much for engaging in this conversation. And I know that you could go on, and there are all sorts of different directions that you could have gone. I just know that people really appreciated the opportunity to hear what you're thinking. I also started thinking about the fact that a number of people told me they were going to Poland. And I was like, what is going on? And apparently, there is a conference, an international conference going on, even as we're having this conversation about the rule of law, violations of due process. And so, as we think about our conversation, our Ohio conversation, there are conversations happening not just around the country about all of these challenges. And it sounds like you want to say something, Omar.
I do want to say one of our Common Cause leaders, Dan Vicuña, who's our Senior Policy Director for Voting and Fair Representation, is in Warsaw, Poland right now at the World Justice Project presenting, because Common Cause won an award for our redistricting work. And so we were recognized at that kind of global rule of law civil society organization for that work.
Well, and I also wanted to be sure to say not just thank you to Subodh and thank you to Omar, but also to the sponsors. Thank you so much, ACLU. Thank you so much, League of Women Voters. A big thank you to the Ohio Fair Courts Alliance. Speaking of organizations you all should check out, please visit the Ohio Fair Court Alliance website. I did want to highlight that what we're going to do is send a recording so that you'll get an email with a follow-up with all of the different links that we shared in the chat and ideas. So if Subodh, you forgot anything that you didn't highlight, same thing with you, Omar. Please send it to us and we'll make sure to get it in the follow-up email. I just wanted to take a moment and think about how hard it is some days to keep going. Yeah. And that we are all part of this working together, and that taking action, getting educated about things, being together in community is one of the ways that we can keep going. And I'm just really, really glad that we're in this together, and we should keep going and keep asking one another questions. I do know there were some questions that were not answered. because they were a little off topic in some cases. I did want to highlight, I'll also later send some information about some things that are happening at the State House with the Article 5 convention. So don't be surprised if that's at the end, because there was a question about that. And I do think we've had enough visitors from other states promoting an Article 5 convention, and we've had multiple hearings. I do want to make sure that you all are aware of what's going on there. So, a big thank you. Final words, Subodh.
Well, I just want everybody to reiterate something. Think about it. The mere fact that a call like this was organized in a matter of weeks and that hundreds of people attended should give you hope. I mean, it really, and it's just a small example of what's taking place on Zoom calls across America right now as we speak, what's taking place in gatherings and communities all across America. I mean, people are energized, people are fired up. Yes, they're also worn out and tired and sleepless and all of those things. I get it. I do this day to day for a living, and sometimes at the end of the day, I'm just like, I cannot believe I'm doom scrolling and seeing what's happened in the news, and I feel powerless, right? But collectively, we're not powerless. Collectively, we're not powerless. Yes, the doom is occurring. It is happening. And we have to recognize that reality. But so many of our fellow citizens and non-citizens alike are fired up and really want to fight for the soul of this country and for our democracy and the rule of law. I see that happening at my alma mater in the clinic with the students. I see that happening in organizations like Common Cause. I see that happening at the civic level with people who've had no prior real interest in politics, who are waking up. So just hold on to that hope every single day and recognize that look, it's going to be a rough 4 years. We're 5 months into this. It is going to get worse before it gets better. But the strength of our movement of people who are finding common cause together is growing.
Omar, any final words, or should we just bid them adieu?
Let's bid them adieu.
All right. A big thank you to you both. And thank you all for joining us this evening. And hopefully we'll see you again on a webinar, or we'll see you in person. I did want to highlight on July 17th, John Lewis, Good Trouble Lives On, is happening all across the country. So check out Mobilize, and you'll find an event near you. And with that, let's go out there and think about ways to create good trouble. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, all.